Jesus of Nazareth, the man millions worship as God, never once explicitly claimed to be God. Not once. This isn't speculation, it's right there in the texts that billions of people consider sacred. For centuries, theologians, priests, and pastors have constructed elaborate doctrines around this figure, but let's get real. If Jesus was trying to clearly and unmistakably declare himself as God, why didn't he just say it outright? Why cloak it in mystery? Let's dive into one of the most explosive passages often cited by Christians to defend this claim, John 8 verse 58. In John 8 verse 58, Jesus says, "Before Abraham was, I am." On the surface, this sounds cryptic, but church tradition insists this is Jesus aligning himself with the God of the Old Testament. The reasoning? The phrase, I am, mirrors the divine name God uses in Exodus 3 verse 14 when he says, I am who I am. But let's pause for a second. Are we seriously going to base a claim of divinity on a two-word phrase spoken in Greek? And who decided that the Jewish audience of the time would interpret this as a declaration of deity? Here's the historical twist. The Jews of the first century weren't debating the doctrine of the Trinity, they didn't even have a concept of it. Their outrage at Jesus' words wasn't necessarily because they thought he was claiming to be God, but because he was challenging their deeply held beliefs about their relationship with Abraham and God. For them, it was blasphemy not because he was saying he was God, but because he dared to put himself in a position of eternal significance. And let's talk language. The New Testament was written in Greek, but Jesus likely spoke in Aramaic or Hebrew. When he used the phrase, I am, it wasn't some magical incantation of divinity. It was a common expression in Semitic languages. Scholars have noted that the Greek rendering of ego eimi might carry connotations of God's name, but in Aramaic or Hebrew, it doesn't pack the same theological punch. In other words, if Jesus did use the phrase, his audience wouldn't have immediately thought, oh, he's claiming to be Yahweh. At the time John's Gospel was written, decades after Jesus' death, the early Christian community was wrestling with who Jesus really was. John's Gospel is the most theologically developed of the four and places heavy emphasis on Jesus' divine nature. But even in this Gospel, there's no direct, unambiguous statement like, I am God, worship me. Instead, what we see are stories, metaphors, and language that point to something more profound, but not necessarily a claim to be the creator of the universe in human form. Think about it, if Jesus truly wanted to make an unmissable claim to divinity, he could have done so in ways that left no room for debate. He could have said, I am Yahweh in the flesh, or I am the God of your ancestors. But he didn't. Instead, he spoke in riddles, parables, and phrases that were open to interpretation. Why? Because his mission wasn't about making people worship him as God. It was about something else entirely. This passage in John 8 verse 58 has been ripped from its historical, linguistic, and cultural context for centuries, turned into a theological weapon to defend ideas that didn't even exist when Jesus walked the earth. The claim that before Abraham was, I am equates to a divine self-revelation is not universally accepted, even among biblical scholars. Some argue it's a statement about Jesus' pre-existence. Others say it's about his role in God's plan. But here's the kicker, even if Jesus was claiming pre-existence, that doesn't automatically make him God. Angels were believed to pre-exist humanity too, and nobody worships them as deities. Let's clear something up right now, the phrase the Son of Man does not mean God. For centuries, preachers and theologians have twisted this term into something it's not. Yet, Jesus himself used this title more than any other to refer to himself. In fact, it appears over 80 times in the Gospels. The term Son of Man has its origins in the Hebrew Bible, particularly in the book of Ezekiel. In Ezekiel, God often addresses the prophet as the Son of Man, a phrase that simply means human being. It emphasizes humanity, mortality, and the fragile nature of being a person. So when Jesus repeatedly calls himself the Son of Man, it's not a cryptic claim to being God, it's a reminder of his humanity. He's identifying with the frailty and struggles of being human. But wait, there's another layer. In Daniel 7 verses 13 to 14, the Son of Man is depicted as a figure who comes on the clouds of heaven and is given authority, glory, and a kingdom by the Ancient of Days. This vision has been interpreted as messianic, pointing to someone who would represent God's authority on earth. By using this title, Jesus wasn't necessarily saying, "I'm God." He was aligning himself with a role of divine authority and mission, but still distinct from the God who gives that authority. Here's where things get interesting. Jewish audiences of Jesus' time didn't expect their Messiah to be divine. They envisioned a human leader, an anointed one who would liberate them from oppression and restore justice. By calling himself the Son of Man, Jesus was likely tapping into this expectation, presenting himself as a figure chosen by God to fulfill a specific purpose. But divine? No. That wasn't even on their radar. Now, let's talk about the reaction to this title in the Gospels. In Mark 2 verse 10, Jesus says, "The Son of Man has authority on earth to forgive sins." This statement shocked his audience, not because they thought he was claiming to be God, but because only God, in their view, had the right to forgive sins. To them, Jesus wasn't acting as God, but stepping into a divine role. That's a critical distinction. Claiming authority doesn't mean claiming divinity. Kings, judges, and prophets claimed God-given authority all the time in Jewish tradition. Fast forward to the early Christian communities. As the movement grew, the title Son of Man started to take on layers of meaning that likely weren't present in Jesus' original usage. By the time the Gospels were written, decades after Jesus' death, his followers were interpreting his life and words in light of their belief in his resurrection. The Son of Man became a title laden with theological implications, but those implications didn't necessarily reflect what Jesus himself intended. It's also worth noting that Jesus used this title in contexts that emphasized suffering and humility. For instance, in Matthew 20 verse 28, he says, "The Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many." That doesn't sound like a God demanding worship. It sounds like someone embracing a role of sacrifice and service, fully aware of the cost. And let's not forget the cultural backdrop. In the Greco-Roman world, the idea of gods walking among humans was common. But the Jewish tradition, which Jesus was steeped in, was fiercely monotheistic. Any suggestion that a human could be God would have been outright heretical. Jesus knew this. His choice to call himself the Son of Man wasn't a careless slip, it was deliberate. He wasn't claiming to be God. He was pointing to his mission, his humanity, and his alignment with God's plan, not his identity as God himself. In Matthew 14 verse 33, after Jesus walks on water and calms the storm, the disciples bow down and say, "Truly, you are the Son of God." Similarly, in John 9 verse 38, after healing a blind man, the man says, "Lord, I believe," and worships him. On the surface, these actions seem straightforward, people bowing, calling him Lord, offering what looks like worship. But dig deeper, and you'll see there's more nuance here than meets the eye. In the ancient Jewish world, worship didn't exclusively mean recognizing someone as divine. The Greek word often translated as worship in the New Testament is proskuneo, which can also mean bowing down in reverence or paying homage to someone in authority. This wasn't reserved for God alone. People bowed to kings, prophets, and even angels as a sign of respect. So when people bowed to Jesus or called him Lord, they weren't necessarily saying, "You are God." They were acknowledging his authority, his role, or even his miraculous powers. In Luke 7, a Roman centurion addresses Jesus as Lord, asking him to heal his servant. This term, Kyrios in Greek, was a common way to address someone with authority or respect. It didn't mean the centurion thought Jesus was Yahweh. It's the same word you'd use to address a master or superior. Context matters, and in most cases, these acts of worship were more about recognizing Jesus as a prophet, healer, or teacher, not as the Almighty God. Now, think about the culture Jesus lived in. The Jewish people were staunchly monotheistic. Worshipping anyone other than Yahweh was blasphemy of the highest order. If Jesus' followers genuinely believed he was God in the flesh, it would have caused an immediate, massive backlash, not just from religious leaders, but from the general population as well. Yet we don't see that kind of widespread outrage recorded in the Gospels. Instead, the conflict is almost always about Jesus challenging religious norms, healing on the Sabbath, or claiming authority over traditions, not about him claiming to be God. Let's talk about another key moment often cited, Thomas's exclamation in John 20 verse 28, "My Lord and my God." This is frequently held up as definitive proof that Jesus' disciples believed he was divine. But even here, interpretation matters. Some scholars suggest Thomas's words were less about addressing Jesus directly as God and more about a moment of astonished realization, praising God for the resurrection. It's not a settled issue, and interpreting this as a blanket affirmation of Jesus' deity requires ignoring a lot of the context and nuance. And here's a historical twist: the idea that Jesus was worshipped as God didn't fully develop until decades after his death. Early Christian writings, like Paul's letters, often describe Jesus in exalted terms, but stop short of calling him God outright. Paul calls Jesus the image of the invisible God and speaks of his exaltation after the resurrection, but he never equates him directly with God the Father. The worship of Jesus as divine evolved gradually, influenced by theological debates and the merging of Jewish and Greco-Roman traditions. Think about how revolutionary this is. If the earliest followers of Jesus didn't see him as God, but as God's chosen representative or Messiah, then the acts of worship recorded in the Gospels take on a completely different meaning. They weren't breaking their monotheistic beliefs, they were acknowledging Jesus as someone uniquely chosen and empowered by God. The belief in Jesus as God didn't come fully formed from the start. It evolved gradually, incrementally, and sometimes contentiously, over decades. Early followers of Jesus didn't agree on who he was. Some saw him as a human prophet, others as a Messiah chosen by God, and only later did some begin to describe him as divine. The earliest Christians were Jewish, and Jewish theology is uncompromisingly monotheistic. For them, God is one, eternal, indivisible, and transcendent. The idea of a man being God in the flesh was not just unthinkable, it was blasphemous. When Jesus' followers began spreading his teachings after his death, their focus wasn't on proclaiming him as God. Instead, they emphasized his role as the Messiah, the anointed one sent by God to fulfill divine promises. Take the Apostle Paul, one of the earliest and most influential figures in Christianity. His letters, written decades before the Gospels, reveal how the first followers of Jesus viewed him. Paul exalts Jesus as the image of the invisible God, Colossians 1 verse 15, and speaks of his resurrection as proof of his divine appointment, but he never equates Jesus with God the Father. Instead, Paul consistently portrays Jesus as subordinate to God. In 1 Corinthians 15 verse 28, Paul explicitly states that after all things are subjected to Jesus, Jesus himself will be subjected to God. This hierarchy is a far cry from later doctrines that proclaim Jesus as co-equal with the Father. Then there's the Gospel of Mark, the earliest of the four Gospels. In Mark's account, Jesus is depicted as a powerful prophet, healer, and teacher, but not as God. His divinity isn't even hinted at in the same way as later Gospels like John. Mark begins with Jesus' baptism, not a divine birth, and emphasizes his humanity throughout. The Gospel of Matthew and Luke, written later, start to elevate Jesus' status by including stories of a miraculous birth. But even here, the focus is on Jesus as God's chosen servant, not God himself. It's in the Gospel of John, written decades after Mark, where we first see a fully developed theology of Jesus as divine. John begins with the famous prologue, "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God." This gospel represents a significant shift, reflecting theological developments that had been brewing for decades. By this time, the Christian movement was no longer exclusively Jewish, it had expanded into the Greco-Roman world, where the idea of divine beings walking among humans was more culturally acceptable. The influence of Greco-Roman thought cannot be overstated. In the Greco-Roman pantheon, gods and demigods frequently interacted with humans, sometimes even taking on human form. As Christianity spread into these cultures, its portrayal of Jesus began to absorb elements of this worldview. The concept of Jesus as a divine figure made sense to a Greco-Roman audience in a way that it never could have to a strictly Jewish one. The real turning point came in the centuries after Jesus' death, as debates over his nature became increasingly heated. Groups like the Ebionites saw Jesus as a human prophet chosen by God, while others, like the Gnostics, viewed him as a divine being who only appeared human. The Arian controversy of the 4th century was one of the most significant battles in early Christian theology. Arius, a priest from Alexandria, argued that Jesus was not eternal or equal to God but a created being, a view that was hugely popular in its time. It wasn't until the Council of Nicaea in 325 CE, under the sponsorship of Emperor Constantine, that the Church officially declared Jesus to be of the same substance as God. But make no mistake, this was a political decision as much as a theological one. Constantine wanted to unify his empire under a single, cohesive doctrine, and the idea of Jesus as divine served that purpose. The Nicene Creed, which emerged from this council, was a product of compromise and debate, not a direct reflection of what Jesus or his earliest followers believed. The Council of Nicaea in 325 CE is where everything took a dramatic turn. Organized by Emperor Constantine, this council was not about theological purity, it was about political unity. Constantine had recently converted to Christianity and saw the growing religion as a tool to unify his empire. But there was a problem: Christians couldn't agree on who Jesus was. At the center of this debate was a priest named Arius, who argued that Jesus was not eternal but a created being, an incredibly exalted one, but not God. His view wasn't a fringe opinion. It was widespread and well supported, especially in the eastern parts of the empire. The other side, led by Athanasius of Alexandria, argued that Jesus was of the same essence as God the Father, co-eternal, co-equal, and fully divine. This wasn't a settled belief at the time, it was one perspective among many. But Constantine wasn't interested in theological nuance. He needed a unified doctrine to stabilize his empire, and he threw his weight behind Athanasius' side. The result was the Nicene Creed, a statement declaring that Jesus was begotten, not made, being of one substance with the Father. This wasn't a divine revelation, it was a political compromise. Many bishops who supported Arius' views were coerced or exiled. Others reluctantly signed the creed under pressure. But here's the kicker: even after Nicaea, the debate didn't end. For decades, the Church swung back and forth between Arian and Nicene positions, with emperors favoring one side or the other depending on their political goals. Fast forward to the Council of Constantinople in 381 CE. By this time, the Nicene position had gained more traction, thanks to imperial enforcement and relentless campaigning by its proponents. At this council, the doctrine of the Trinity, the idea that God exists as three persons in one essence, was formally established. But let's be clear, this concept isn't explicitly laid out in the Bible. It was a theological construct developed over centuries to reconcile competing ideas about Jesus, God, and the Holy Spirit. And then there was the Council of Chalcedon in 451 CE, which tackled another critical question: how could Jesus be both fully God and fully human? The result was the doctrine of the hypostatic union, which declared that Jesus had two natures, divine and human, united in one person. Again, this wasn't a universally accepted belief. It was the outcome of intense debate, political maneuvering, and the suppression of dissenting voices. One of the most striking things about these councils is how much disagreement there was among early Christians. Groups like the Ebionites believed Jesus was entirely human, chosen by God to fulfill a special mission. The Docetists, on the other hand, argued that Jesus was purely divine and only appeared to be human. The Arians viewed him as a created being, while the Nicene faction insisted he was co-eternal with God. These weren't minor differences, they were fundamental disagreements about Jesus' identity. What these councils did was impose a single narrative onto a diverse and fragmented movement. They silenced alternative views, often through force, and declared their version of Jesus to be the only valid one. This wasn't about discovering some long-lost truth, it was about consolidating power and creating a unified doctrine that could serve as the foundation for an emerging empire-wide church. Let's get something straight: the way Jesus spoke was not designed for 21st century readers with doctrinal expectations. His words were rooted in the language, culture, and context of first-century Palestine, and when stripped from that context, they've been twisted into claims he likely never intended. If we examine his statements critically and historically, what emerges is a man who spoke with authority about God, not as God. Take, for instance, the often cited statement in John 10 verse 30, "I and the Father are one." This verse has been used as a cornerstone for arguing Jesus' divinity, but let's pause for a moment. The original Greek word for one here is hen, which indicates unity of purpose or mission, not identity or essence. Jesus wasn't saying, "I am God." He was affirming his alignment with God's will. Context matters, and just a few verses later, he clarifies, "The Father is greater than I," John 14 verse 28. That doesn't sound like someone claiming equality with God. In fact, Jesus often distinguished himself from God. In Mark 10 verse 18, when someone addresses him as good teacher, Jesus responds, "Why do you call me good? No one is good but God alone." Think about that. If Jesus wanted to be recognized as God, this was the perfect moment to make it clear. Instead, he redirects the focus entirely away from himself and onto God. And what about his frequent prayers? Time and again, Jesus is shown praying to the Father, seeking guidance and strength. The Gospels repeatedly depict him as dependent on God, not co-equal with him. In Matthew 26 verse 39, during his agony in Gethsemane, he prays, "My Father, if it is possible, let this cup pass from me, yet not what I want, but what you want." This is the voice of someone submitting to a higher authority, not someone claiming to be that authority. Now, let's talk about the term Son of God. This phrase is another one that's been heavily loaded with theological meaning over the centuries, but in Jesus' time, it didn't necessarily imply divinity. In the Hebrew Bible, Son of God was used to describe Israel, Exodus 4 verse 22, angels, Job 1 verse 6, and even kings, Psalm 2 verse 7. It was a title of honor and closeness to God, not a declaration of being God. When Jesus called himself the Son of God, he was likely emphasizing his unique relationship with God and his role in God's mission, not asserting equality with the Creator of the universe. In John 17 verse 21, Jesus prays for his followers to be one just as he and the Father are one. Does this mean he's asking them to become divine? Of course not. He's talking about unity in purpose and mission. If his oneness with God is interpreted as a claim to divinity, then by that logic, his followers should also be considered divine. Clearly, that's not what he meant. Let's not overlook how Jesus framed his teachings. He constantly referred to himself as someone sent by God, not someone who is God. Statements like "the one who sent me is true," John 7 verse 28, or "if I do nothing on my own, but speak just what the Father has taught me," John 8 verse 28, reinforce this. These are the words of a servant, a messenger, not the originator. Even the miracles attributed to Jesus point back to God as the source of his power. After raising Lazarus from the dead, Jesus prays openly, "Father, I thank you that you have heard me. I knew that you always hear me, but I said this for the benefit of the people standing here," John 11 verses 41 to 42. He doesn't claim the act as his own, but explicitly attributes it to God working through him. The tendency to retroactively read Jesus' statements as declarations of divinity comes not from the texts themselves, but from centuries of interpretation shaped by doctrinal debates and theological agendas. What's clear from the Gospels is that Jesus consistently positioned himself as subordinate to God. His words were those of someone pointing others toward God, not someone claiming to be God. How the apostles and gospel writers presented Jesus, and how their interpretation shaped what billions believe today. What you'll see is that their accounts were not just about recording history, they were about making a case, persuading an audience, and addressing the issues of their time. The Jesus we meet in the Gospels isn't necessarily the man who walked the earth, it's the Jesus filtered through the beliefs, needs, and agendas of his followers. The earliest writings about Jesus come from Paul, not the Gospels. Paul's letters were written decades before Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John, and they give us a snapshot of how Jesus' followers viewed him in the first few decades after his death. Paul talks about Jesus as a divine figure who was exalted by God after his resurrection. But here's the thing, Paul never quotes Jesus directly. He never mentions his miracles, parables, or even the details of his life. Paul's focus is almost entirely on Jesus' death and resurrection, presenting him as the key to salvation rather than as God incarnate. The Gospels, written later, introduce more about Jesus' life and teachings, but they're not biographies in the modern sense. Each Gospel was written for a specific audience with a specific purpose. Mark, the earliest Gospel, emphasizes Jesus' role as a suffering servant, aligning him with Jewish expectations of the Messiah. Matthew, written for a predominantly Jewish audience, portrays Jesus as the fulfillment of Old Testament prophecies. Luke, addressing a Gentile audience, presents Jesus as a universal Savior for all people. John, the latest and most theological of the Gospels, takes it a step further, emphasizing Jesus' divine nature in a way the earlier Gospels don't. What's fascinating is how the details of Jesus' life and identity are adapted and expanded over time. For instance, the virgin birth, a cornerstone of Christian belief today, is mentioned only in Matthew and Luke. Mark, the earliest Gospel, says nothing about it. John doesn't mention it either. This isn't to say the story was fabricated, but it shows how the narrative evolved to meet the theological needs of different communities. The apostles and gospel writers were also dealing with challenges from outside their movement. As Christianity spread into the Roman Empire, it encountered philosophical and religious ideas that shaped how Jesus was portrayed. In a world influenced by Greco-Roman thought, where gods often took human form, portraying Jesus as divine made him more relatable to a non-Jewish audience. At the same time, within the Jewish community, calling Jesus Son of God or even hinting at his divinity was controversial and led to fierce opposition. The gospel writers walked a tightrope, crafting narratives that could resonate with both audiences. Let's not forget that these texts were written decades after Jesus' death, in a world where oral tradition was the primary way stories were passed down. The apostles didn't write down their experiences immediately, they preached, debated, and shared their memories of Jesus in the context of their missions. By the time these stories were committed to writing, they had been shaped by years of interpretation and retelling. It's no wonder the Gospels sometimes differ in details or emphasis. Even within the New Testament, there's evidence of debate about who Jesus was. The letter to the Hebrews describes Jesus as made lower than the angels, Hebrews 2 verse 9, while John's Gospel describes him as the Word who was with God and was God, John 1 verse 1. These aren't minor discrepancies, they reflect the diversity of thought in early Christianity. Some saw Jesus as fully human, chosen by God. Others saw him as pre-existent and divine. These debates weren't resolved until centuries later, as we saw with the councils of Nicaea and Chalcedon. What's undeniable is that the apostles and gospel writers believed Jesus was extraordinary. They saw him as someone through whom God worked in unprecedented ways, someone whose teachings and actions revealed the divine in a profoundly unique manner. But the way they expressed that belief was influenced by their time, their culture, and their audience. Their writings are a mix of faith, history, and theology, not a straightforward account of who Jesus was. So here we are, 2,000 years later, looking back at texts that have been analyzed, debated, and interpreted countless times. The Jesus of history and the Jesus of faith are not the same. The Jesus presented by the apostles and gospel writers is a testament to their belief in him, their hope for humanity, and their response to the challenges of their world. Thank you for staying with me through this deep dive into one of the most fascinating topics in history. Whether you're here out of curiosity, skepticism, or faith, I appreciate you taking the time to explore this with me. Keep questioning, keep seeking, and I'll see you in the next video. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments below. Thank you.